Okay, so let us now move on to our second application, which is voting. Now, whenever we hear the word voting, we have in mind elections to select politicians, right? Prime ministers or elections to kind of like select members of parliament or to select members of the local legislative assembly and so on. However, in if we think about it broadly, voting is something actually much more general than just electing politicians, right? So voting is generally used in situations where you have got a group of people who are trying to reach a single decision that in some sense will make speak for the group, right? So for example, in the elections case, what happens is that you have got a set of population who are deciding to vote among a set of candidates and decide who is going to represent them in the legislative assembly or in parliament, for example, right? You can also have the legislative body themselves deciding whether to kind of like pass a bill or not, right? So that will be one single decision whether the bill has been passed or not. That is going to be decided for the whole group. You have got juries who decide whether to kind of like have the defendant vote guilty or innocent, right? That is juries deciding to vote in a trial. You have got prize committees voting on the recipient of an award, right? So think about the Oscar and how it is kind of like decided. You have got a set of movies, then there is basically a vote, and then kind of like people decide, who to kind of like give the award to, right? You've got a group of critics who often vote on the top movies of the past century. So this is how this list often come out. What are the top books? What are the top movies of the past century? So you basically have a lot of people having different opinion and then did vote, right? You also have votes being awarded for sporting prizes. So for every year there is a prize for the best footballer, right? Which is the Ballon d'Or prize. And that is again kind of like decided by voting among different experts, right? So what is common among all these cases is that you have got at the end of the day one single decision that comes around, right? So that is a single outcome that stands for the whole group, even though the group as a whole may have individuals who would have different preferences, right? So that is one common thing. Now, if you think about it in reality, there are actually a very different class of methods that are available for reaching this group decision, right? So just to give you some examples of just considering elections to elect different politicians in India, United States, and France, there are different procedures that are followed, right? So in the Indian system, for example, you have that there are constituencies, right? And for each constituency, you have got basically people voting for a particular person, right? And the person who gets the most vote is basically the person who is elected, right? And then you have got for each constituency, this is how elections happen, and then they are elected into parliament, and then they are kind of like, in parliament that on the basis of that, you have got decisions about, for example, which party is going to have the prime minister and so on, right? In the United States presidential election, for example, this is not how it happens, right? So you basically have different options that are available to people, right? And on the basis of that, at each place, people can decide how to kind of like vote, and the same outcome is going to happen for each states, right? And then you have got on the basis of that, electoral college votes are decided. So whenever you hear about the US news, you kind of hear not about whether this particular city is going to be won or not, but you hear about, which candidate won which state, right? So that, and then the whole state's kind of like votes goes to that particular candidate. Again, in France, you have a very different system. So typically you have a two-stage voting kind of situation where, just to simplify matters a lot, basically in the first stage, you have a system that unless a candidate wins a majority of votes, right, and subject to some more caveats, there's going to be a second follow-up round where in some cases you have got only the two top candidates going on, or in other cases you have got a limited number of candidates advancing from the first stage to the second stage, and then you have potentially another round of election, right? So then one question that naturally compares is that, can we somehow compare these three different systems? Like, can we think of like one being better than the other, right? So that is one question. The second thing to note is that, in each of these cases, we had a system where you have got a single winner being selected, but you can have a different situation where the outcome of the voting need not be a single winner being selected, but the goal is to produce a ranked list, right? So again, this is kind of like going back to the example that we talked about, that you want to have the list of greatest movies of the 20th century, or the list of the greatest songs of the 1990s, or the list of the greatest players of all time, right? So there you would want to perhaps kind of like rank, or the list of like greatest cricket matches for India in the World Cup, right? So that would be another example where not necessarily you would be interested in just like what is the greatest cricket match, right? But you might want to have what are the top five greatest cricket matches, right? And there you would want to have kind of like different critics who might have different opinion, different experts. And then the question is, how do you combine those different opinions, right? So that's the exercise. So voting is used in very different type of situations. So one situation where it is used is that basically you've got voters who disagree because of their genuine differences in their subjective evaluations and not necessarily because of differences in their information, right? So going back to the football's greatest player list, suppose that you want to compare Maradona and Pele, who were like two great footballers. So when you have got experts who are disagreeing whether to rank Maradona or Pele as the greatest football player of all time, they are not generally disagreeing because they do not have enough information about the two players, right? It's not that you can give somebody more information and get them to change their mind. So they're genuinely disagreeing because they kind of like evaluate some particular skill more than the other, right? Whether your kind of like individual skills matter or not, whether your how many tournaments you won and so on. So different experts have different opinion on this, and they are kind of like coming up with on the basis of this different opinion, there's different subjective beliefs about who is the greatest, right? So that is one situation. However, in other situations, you have got that basically everybody kind of like wants to kind of get to the same conclusion, right? But the difficulty is that you have got lack of information, right? So if you had all the same information relevant to making a decision, perhaps the groups would like to be unanimous, right? So jury verdicts is a common example. So there you genuinely want to kind of have a situation where you actually punish the guilty party and free the innocent party, right? So that is the idea, and everybody agrees on this criteria, right? The problem in the jury verdicts is that basically you've got different people with different information, right? And different background to interpret that interpretations. And so hence you have got disagreements among juries, right? So juries, in case you are not familiar with, is a system where you have got, let's say, a set of 12 people, and they are kind of like watching a trial, and at the end of the trial they have to vote whether they vote guilty or innocent, and on the basis of the votes that come out, then the final verdict is going to be decided, right? Whether the prisoner is to be kind of set free or punished for the alleged offense, right? That's the idea. Okay, so why do we care about voting? I mean, it's interesting theoretically, but it has a lot of practical applications as well, right? So, for example, when it comes to recent online applications, it has seen a lot of use. So you've got different web search engines which produce different rankings of results, right? So how do you come up with those rankings of results? That one question. And if you have different search engines producing different rankings of result, how can you combine these different rankings to come up with one ranking, right? That's one question. If you have been to kind of like Amazon and these other places, you would often have a kind of like a recommendation system. You'll see where kind of they would recommend, some books for you to kind of like read based on the pages that you're seeing. So what is happening in that case is that you have got Amazon kind of like in the background, looking at people who have similar tastes as yours and seeing how they kind of like rank different things based on their purchases, right? And now they are going to kind of develop a rank system for you where they combine the ranking of these different people who they think have similar tastes, and on the basis of that come out with a ranking of different books, and then kind of decide how many of those books to kind of like recommend to you for purchase, right? So similar thing happens with like how Netflix recommends movies and so on. So here the objective is not to come up with a global ranking system, but to come up with a ranking system which is useful for different individuals, right? So some questions that naturally arise and that we will try to kind of make sense in our discussion is that how should we produce a single ranking from the conflicting opinions provided by multiple voters, right? So you have got different voters who have like different beliefs, right? Different rankings, different preferences. How do you kind of aggregate them, like sum them up to kind of like get a single ranking over the different options that are available? So you'll see that, in our mind, we have this viewpoint that majority voting is perhaps the most natural thing to use. So is majority voting a good mechanism? That's one question that we want to think about. Or put it another way, what are the different drawbacks of using majority voting as a mechanism to aggregate ranking? Can we come up with better voting systems than majority voting? And more generally, if you start thinking about it, how do we kind of like start ranking different voting systems and thinking about whether a voting system is good or not? So these are some of the things that we are going to consider in our discussion as we move forward while discussing voting.